This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Hey, you got orcs in my spaceship.
And tonight, we're going to be talking about fantasy. Not space fantasy per se, as Don was just talking about, although Warhammer 40k is indeed awesome, and we'll talk about that in another show. But we're going to be talking about fantasy in general. As a genre, what is fantasy exactly? Where did it come from? What's it doing? You know, what does it like to do on Friday nights? We're going to find out. And maybe even where it's going someday. It's probably going to go to college, but it's still trying to decide what to do with its life.
It's going to take a year off, travel Europe, find itself.
Exactly. That's what I expect fantasy to do. Anyway, so first, I guess we should probably start with the basics, right? So, yeah. Don, what is fantasy? How would you define it?
All right, I'm going to give, because I think it applies even more in this case, my quintessential don't get wrapped around the axle about definition speech.
You suck. Sorry, I'm just getting it out of the way now.
Okay. So, well, and I say that because there's always, fantasy's one of them things, there's always a big, huge debate. I always defined it as, is there a wizard and a guy with a sword in it? Yep, it's fantasy.
That's a general description, although there are fantasy stories that don't involve magic. You can do fantasy without magic, where it's just kind of alternate world stuff, but there's not magic per se in it. And There's some settings where magic is, I would put magic in quotes because it, for example, is actually psionics or sci-fi stuff for that going on, serving the place of magic, I guess. Yeah,
I think that's kind of where you can already see a definition. Mm-hmm. Fantasy's been around for a long time. Somebody's already usurped every aspect of it you can name. Mm-hmm. In general terms, I think fantasy, you can say it refers to like an archaic setting. Mm-hmm. They're not generally modern. They're what we consider old-timey. Ours in the West are usually like Middle Ages, Dark Ages kind of stuff.
Yep, almost always, yeah.
Yeah, you've got humanity may not be the dominant species. You may or may not have magic. Mm-hmm. Magic kind of takes the place in a lot of ways of science.
Usually, yeah.
And magic often comes out of the idea of theology or myth, which are more important to the setting than, say, like science fiction.
Right.
And there's a famous What's New from a Really Old Dragon that Phil Foglio approached this. What's the difference between science fiction and fantasy? And he basically, one of the things, he starts the comic saying, well, there really isn't any, see ya. But they get more into it, and he says that idea of myth, as he says, the romanticism is one of the big differences. And he shows this wizard, and he's got a wand, and he's casting this fireball. And then they show this, like, science fiction warrior guy in the same pose, and he's got, like, a laser pistol, and he's shooting the same blast. And then he says, but the big difference between fantasy and sci-fi is this mythology's romanticism. And they show this other character asking the wizard, where did you get that? I had to face the army of Rangoon while digging through the dark tunnels of blah, blah, blah. And he's got this big explanation. And then the next panel is the sci-fi guy. Where'd you get it? Sears, $29.95.
Yeah, you could work with that. I mean, I might go a little simpler than that and say fantasy is an imaginative yesterday and science fiction is an imaginative tomorrow.
That's pretty good. I think, again, like I said, that's already, everything we've both said has been usurped already.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because I think there's, especially in the last 20 years, there's been different permutations on that.
Because you could do, I mean, they don't technically call it fantasy, but for example, some people have written, alternate world fiction where it's like, well, what if the Nazis, won, or, what if, the Mongols won, or whatever, things like that, and they set stories that way. So I would consider those fantasy, actually. Although I know they're generally called, alternate world stories, as I just said, they're still a form of fantasy, again, depending on how they play out. But if the technology aspect is played down, it's usually fantasy. I mean, unless it's steampunk, in which case it's steampunk. So, a yesterday, basically, where, as you said, magic is often taking the place of science will work. But some post-apocalyptic stuff, I would argue, is still fantasy as well, mostly because, again, the technology's disappeared, right? The technology is being replaced by something else, or is very limited at best.
Or I would even say it's presented differently.
True.
Because you've already mentioned Warhammer 40,000.
Yep, that's true.
And I would consider that a proper fantasy setting over a sci-fi setting.
Yes, I would agree.
And it's because there's technology, but it's presented as magic. It's the idea is that tens of thousands of years ago, humanity lost the ability to understand it, but it was advanced enough that the technology perpetuates itself.
Right.
So you have it all, like there's in the original Rogue Trader book, there's a little section about activating a robot.
Right.
Thou shalt striketh twice the rune marked on. If the iron beast does not animate it, prayers and venerations to the machine god are said. And it's technology, but again, it's presented as fantasy. And even just the little bit we've discussed here, that idea of fantasy as a term has a lot of connotations, because when you say fantasy, most people think sword and sorcery.
Yeah, pretty much.
Which I think is what we're gonna work with here, but fantasy generally can mean anything that's not real. So if the Nazis win World War II and we're all goose-stepping in the streets now, that's properly fantasy, but it's not what we would apply that term to. Right.
Yeah, I agree. So most people, when they think of fantasy, when they hear the word fantasy, they're thinking of Tolkien/D&D for the most part. I mean, that's fantasy for and variants thereof. That's what fantasy is for most people as a commonly understood genre. That's it, basically.
Yeah, I think what we can do, because I had 5 types of fantasy.
Okay, well, let's go into that. Otherwise, we're just here in the weeds, basically arguing back and forth over really tiny stuff, and our audience is probably already bored to tears. So let's get into your definitions. Let's do this.
Yeah, I think I'd start with that ties into what we said before. The first kind of fantasy I would say is historical fantasy. Which
how would you define it?
It's basically where you take some kind of olden times and you present an unreal story, but with the laws of olden times. And you can do it where, say, it would be ancient Greece, and it's more or less a straight-up story set in ancient Greece with characters that never existed.
Right, okay.
Or you could do an ancient Greece story that takes place in ancient Greece, but where the myth and all of that and the prevalent philosophies of the day are real.
Yes. Wouldn't that be the difference between what's commonly referred to as high fantasy and low fantasy?
It kind of is, because there's a weird caveat, because high and low fantasy are basically what I'd say are the next categories.
Okay. Got it. But okay, that's definitely historical fantasy, which can be played as realistic historical fantasy, basically, or more fantastical historical fantasy.
Yeah.
Okay, that definitely works. Yeah, I can totally see that, and I think most people would agree with that.
Yeah, because typical, fantasy usually takes place not in our proper history, but in kind of
pseudo-history.
Yeah, so a lot of what we consider fantasy in the West draws from, like I said, it'll be like medieval Europe is the template, but it's not the same countries or anything. You go to the East, a lot of Eastern sword and sorcery fantasy is basically set in feudal China, but it's not feudal China. It borrows a lot of the trappings of it.
Yes, yeah, pretty much, yeah.
And it's because, again, it's like you were saying, fantasy is this past that didn't happen, so that's where our minds go, and we'll usually start from something familiar.
Right. And that's generally done because, like, the less you make the audience's imagination work, the better. I know that sounds wrong, but that's actually kind of how it works in real writing and creating fantasy settings and stuff. Everyone wants to create their original fantasy setting, but the truth is, what the audience wants is a setting that's easy to understand.
Yeah.
And guess what? That's the real setting for the most part, or what their conception of real history or the real setting was.
Yeah.
So that's why it's generally best for most, and this is what most writers do, is to just take quote-unquote medieval Europe, and then you put this little spin on it, and the spin is the focus. The audience will already understand the medieval Europe concept, and we just put the spin on it, and we're good to go.
Yeah, because we said that a few episodes ago. When you write, if you're writing the fantastical, it's generally accepted that you add one fantastic element to what the audience already knows.
Yep.
And that's it. And you can do a lot more, because if you use like a generic fantasy setting, everybody already knows what wizards are, and there's going to be a dragon and probably dungeons and stuff like that. So you've already cribbed in a bunch of the extra effects.
Exactly, and it lets you add one more extra thing on top of that to kind of customize your generic fantasy setting.
Yep.
And you don't have to actually explain what a generic fantasy setting is. You don't even have to explain magic in a fantasy setting anymore. Yep. It's just, if it's a fantasy setting, orcs, dwarves, magic, dragons, just like you said.
Yep, and then that's where you get the idea of high and low. High fantasy is basically, it's Tolkien.
Yep.
Low fantasy is Conan.
Okay. I guess that works. I guess that works as a definition. I mean, I have seen some stuff, and this has been more common in the last decade or so, but I've seen it before. What I would call really high fantasy. Like, there's stuff where it's about, gods fighting each other and stuff like that. Yeah. And I think that's another level beyond Tolkien. I think that would be high fantasy, but very, very high fantasy.
It is, and this is one of the tricky things, is high fantasy, one of the biggest differences between high and low is high fantasy is epic.
Right.
It's the top of the food chain. It's the kings, the queens, the empires. Low fantasy is typically more personal.
Right, okay.
It's the individual adventurer. It's the guy trying to get through. If it's about a king, then it's about, like, his life and the people he interacts with, and him dealing with the plots and the stab in the back and all that kind of thing.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that works.
And that's the big difference, because they're very similar. Because, again, if you get to Lord of the Rings...
Right.
It's basically about the gods. It's
kind of. Yeah, okay.
Because it's a lot of the characters... If they're not godlike, they're portrayed almost as demi, like Gandalf. Gandalf literally comes back from the dead.
Well, Gandalf is a minor god. He pretty much is. Yeah.
Well, how he's presented, even like Galadriel is presented that she's this like all-powerful like elf, and
right. Yeah, it's true.
And you're fighting Sauron, who is like the living embodiment of evil.
That's true. It's very epic. Yep.
I think what happens there is to get to your idea that we're actually seeing stories with the gods, and we've seen them. They were done like in ancient Greece and that.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
We saw the same stories. It's because the Tolkien stuff is presented as being huge, but if you get into like Lord of the Rings and that, none of it is actually huge.
Right.
It's presented because the example is the One Ring, which everybody, you get that, you control the world. What does it do? It makes you invisible and turns you chaotic evil. Like, that's all we see it do.
Yeah, for a ring that was supposed to control the world, it really doesn't do anything.
No, but it's presented as, and that's where I think the high fantasy, the origins of it come from, because in Tolkien's work, especially Lord of the Rings, it's the story over the fact, and then that leads more to the epicness, and then that's what everybody draws whenever they do like a high fantasy thing.
That makes sense. Although, wasn't there the catch in Lord of the Rings? Sorry, this bugs me now. Isn't it the catch that there were all these rings, magic rings, that were given to the various kings of the land? Like, so many to the elves, so many to the dwarves, so many to the humans. And isn't the whole point of the One Ring, it's the ring that you can use to actually dominate the others if they're wearing the other rings. I thought that was the point.
No, there's that. It's the one ring to rule them all, but we never really get explained what that means.
Yeah, do we ever even see the other rings? I don't think we do.
No, they get mentioned because it wasn't it like 9 for the elves?
Yeah.
And 7 for the humans, because the ring wraiths are actually they're was it the human kings that got converted to evil?
Oh, so they were the ones who were wearing the rings. That's what they're called, the ring wraiths.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. That's where they are. Okay, got it.
So you get this, and again, you get this idea of epicness, but because like if you've played like D&D, the ring wraiths are like a level 6 encounter.
They are? That's it?
Kinda. There was a semi-famous article from an early issue of Dragon.
Right.
Where they pointed out that Gandalf is only 5th level if you go by D&D rules. Everything he does could be done at 5th level.
Mind you, in old D&D, 5th level was actually something.
Yeah, it's pretty good. But I mean, it's the idea that a lot of his spells and that, the few that he actually uses, have a lot of flash and panache to them, but the actual effects are kind of...
Right. Yeah, but being able to go toe-to-toe with a Balrog in that's a little more than 5th level.
Yeah, but if you remember, he dies, so he doesn't go toe-to-toe with the Balrog.
He tries, but it doesn't go out so well.
Yeah.
Okay, because the thing is, what gets me, and people can go check this out if they want, go watch some of the... Chinese fantasy movies. There's a lot of them on Netflix these days, especially like the Monkey King ones that they've got on Netflix, and that's god level stuff.
Yeah,
and the Chinese love their god level special effects fest, and they really are. All those characters are like Superman level, and I'm not kidding when I say god level stuff. They're like the basic characters are Superman level, and then they go up from there in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
and so they're really powerful. And we're watching these gods go toe to toe with each other, and that's like a whole other thing that doesn't even resemble Tolkien-esque fantasy at this point.
No, but it does. We do have things like that in the West. You do have a lot of, like I said, if you go back to, like, say, ancient Greece.
Right, yeah.
Like, it's literally like Hercules is the son of the gods, and you have a lot of that.
Yeah, that's true.
If you go to, say, even in Europe, like the Celts, a lot of the Celtic stories. Which I can't for the life of me pronounce properly. But they're all about like the gods and the children of the gods and like these epic heroes that they're supposedly like human, but they're just so awesomely human that they reach superheroic proportion.
Right. I guess my point would be that I kind of think that there may be at least, if we want to be picky about it, 3 levels. Like there's low fantasy, which I agree with, high fantasy, and very high fantasy, which is the god level stuff, which I think is really a different category. But that's my personal take. Yeah,
I don't entirely think you need that new category, but I do totally agree with your reasoning. And this is, like I say, why, again, I try not to get too worried. The definitions are good to start the debate.
Right, okay, that's true.
And then, because, yeah, you're totally right. And because that idea, what you're getting at, comes back in the 5th, in a weird way, in the 5th kind of fantasy.
Revenge of the Fifth. Okay, so so we've covered 3 then. So historical, high, and low. Let's move on then.
The next one I would say is, and we've already dealt with this, is you can call it apocalyptic and or sci-fi.
Okay.
Or I guess science fantasy is one of the things.
So how do you define this?
Because we talked about in the apocalyptic RPG thing how your original apocalypse role-playing games like Gamworld, Metamorphosis Alpha. Gamworld is Dungeons & Dragons after World War III. Metamorphosis Alpha is Dungeons & Dragons on a spaceship. Right. At their core. And they use a lot of the fantasy tropes and they use a lot of the fantasy ideas. And for gaming, a lot of the fantasy gaming notions that D&D originated. And they sort of become their own thing. You can't exactly call them science fiction proper.
No.
And I know people be like, no, it's like hard and soft and I don't care. Shut up. It becomes its own thing because again, you loop back around where the technology becomes the magic instead of magic being the technology.
Right.
And you get things like nanites were a descriptor that came out like in the 90s. Nanotechnology was the answer to everything.
Yep.
But you could look at older stuff from like the 60s or 70s, and you could say nanotechnology explained a lot of things that happened, like self-repairing robots and things like that. Even if it was never mentioned at that time, because it's filling that magical niche.
Right.
The technology because magic is the one thing, it's the caveat that you can add to any of these categories.
Right.
Do you have a lot of it or a little of it? And what magic typically is, it's a force that people can control, but they never totally understand.
Okay, so the key is that they don't understand it.
Not completely, and that's why you'll get things like there can always be some weird effect. Now, I've seen people piss and moan that that's why science fiction is superior to fantasy, because it's got like rules that are solid and are adhered to right up until they aren't. See nanotechnology. But a good fantasy story takes that into account.
Right.
That there's always something to the magic that it's beyond us. It's our technology we can control in sci-fi.
Right.
Even if it's like a self-aware Dyson sphere that we built, we still have some kind of control or relatability to it. Whereas magic, there's always going to be it's a power we draw from some mysterious source, and we may know the principles of drawing that power, but not fully understand the source.
At what point, then, does magic just turn into another form of technology?
Again, I would say this is a good reason why it pays to not get hung up on it, because it can go back and forth either way. And it can go back and forth in the same setting. It can go... My definition...
Right.
That I use, and it's like I said, it's just magic is something that we control but don't necessarily fully understand.
Right.
And a lot of technology can broach that, because there's all kind, like you get into that, let's say, with superhero stuff. That we've discussed how technology in a superhero setting is weird because a lot of it's unique. And a lot of it is because there's some kind of accident that the hero builds the one super suit but can't figure out how to build more, because, that was when the lightning bolt came through the window and hit chemical X and that blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then
some excuse why they don't just build an army of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it broaches that thing. Is it magic or not? Well, technically it is, but it's painted with the science fiction brush.
Right.
So it's not proper fantasy, but it's not proper sci-fi, hence superhero.
Okay. I would agree with that. Yeah. I think most superpowers fall under that category. Yeah, one form or another. They're ultimately usually magic spells under one form or another.
So that's, for your fantasy setting, there's going to be magic.
Right.
And it's a question of, is there a lot of it or is there a little of it? And then that you can apply that to any of the categories.
Right. And so I assume then you would consider Star Wars to be science fantasy. It would come under this category as well.
No, Star Wars is science fiction.
Mind blown. Okay, why?
Well, just because everybody says it, but there's the Force. There is, but the Force is kind of painted as theology.
Okay.
And I think theology, it's a separate thing story-wise from magic.
Because magic settings have clerics all the time who are doing magic stuff. There have been whole novels written about cleric people doing magic stuff. Witch doctors, shamans, that's also theology.
It is, but then again, there's also going to be like the wizard that memorizes the formula and stuff in there somewhere.
Not always.
Not always.
You could do stuff. You could do a fantasy novel about clerics, and it would still be fantasy.
Yeah, you can, but again, it's how it's presented. How can I explain this?
I was going to say, because I'm sorry, dude, I can't agree at all. The way the Force is presented in Star Wars is 110% magic.
Actually, I can make us both sad and win the argument.
Okay, go for it.
No, it's totally science fiction because it's midichlorians. And they form a psionic network with each other, and that's how that idea of it binds us. It's just the midichlorian psionic network. I win and feel dead inside.
I do too. Okay, pre-midichlorian Star Wars, in the original trilogy, it is magic.
It is, and again, this is, like I say, the idea of not getting super hung up on the the definitions, because it is it's kind of a side thing, and you could call it science fantasy. I consider it science fiction because the focus is mostly on the spaceships.
That's an interesting point. Okay.
And like I said, and that goes with, remember what I said, the other spaceship? It's science fiction. It's a wizard.
There you go.
Yeah.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah. So that's why I say I don't get too worried about. But yeah, I think you can go either way. Theology, I think, is always different. Because, again, magic is always an absolute.
Right.
And theology almost always, has a weird veneer to it that you don't know if it's an absolute or not. And
depends on the setting and the god we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's why I think it can bridge that gap depending on how you present it. Because if you have it, like, say, the Force, you can make that argument that it's just, this is how they explain psionics. Okay.
Yeah, you could.
And
I've seen that done.
And psionics, because, again, it's not technology, but it comes from, like, the kind of organized thinking that leads to technology. So generally we can control it to some degree. It can be like, it's magic dressed up as science fiction, but it ultimately is.
Right.
But again, if you dress it up like that, I think it leans more that way. And if you disagree, it's fine. It doesn't make a huge diff. But there's that, like, vagueness about it.
Right.
And that's where, like, the theology comes in, that the philosophy behind it is it, like, really this mythical force, or is it just what we're calling a manifestation of mind power?
Okay, but one could argue that in many fantasy settings, that's all quote unquote magic is. Like in most Asian, like wuxia stuff, and that's all it is there too. I mean, that's where the force comes from, right?
Yep.
He's borrowing it from Taoism and the whole, you're taking control over the chi energies that run through all things in the universe, including your body. So you control the chi in your body to do magical effects and things like that, or to jump over stuff and to run on walls and stuff, whatever. And heal yourself. Meanwhile, you can also combine your chi with the energies around you, the natural energies, to like cast a like fireball or something.
No, that's all real. Ninjas can do that.
Well, yeah, of course. But besides that, I mean, but that's where the force comes from. Really, it's just George Lucas borrowing like Asian style magic is really what it is.
Yep, and I think that's again where you when you get to this becomes an issue with historical fantasy. That, and this is where I think the idea of theology being something a little different comes from, because religions are generally they're real, whether or not you believe in the theology or not, or if there's a higher power or not.
Okay, this
religion exists, and this is where I said you can do like a historical fantasy where if you have magic. And it comes from the gods, that it's this religion, it's the standard fantasy cleric. There's all kinds of ways of presenting that, even if it's real. And a lot of that comes up into the idea of how do you want to present the religions of the setting.
Right.
And because if you're doing a historical one and they're real religions, there's a lot, I don't want to say baggage, but baggage that's connected to that.
That's true.
Because, again, this is something that's considered real. Like, so there are Taoists.
Oh, yeah. They still exist. There's lots of them.
Yeah, and so that's a thing, and that's a philosophy, and that has weight because there's people that believe in that.
Right.
Try as, like, fans might, there are no Jedi.
It breaks my heart, but I'll admit there are no Jedi except in Australia, where you can put it on the census if you want.
Well, you can put whatever you want on the census. It doesn't mean it's going to get like counted.
Well, that's true. I think UK has that too. It's actually, you can write in Jedi if you want.
Yeah, because most countries for religion in the census, they have other and a blank.
Right. Okay, that's true. Well, technically, in a legal perspective, they are Jedi. They just have no magic powers.
That we know of.
Dun, dun, dun. This is where you and I would, I say, again, differ a tiny bit. I would say that it depends on what role the religion and theology that plays in the story.
Right.
Especially when we're dealing with fantasy settings and, made up religions and such. If the religion, whatever, the cleric is just there to cast healing spells and, mumble some pious words every now and then and preach about, love your brother or whatever, or kill everything if they're a cleric of an evil god, then I would argue that that's really just a fancy magic user. They're not really acting as a element of the religion, not truly in the story. Now, but if the religion aspect, the social aspect of the religion, and the cultural aspect does play a role in the story and does play a major role in the setting, at that point, I think it is different. I would agree with you on that. I think that it is one of those things where it depends on how it's presented and what its role is in the story. Okay, so sometimes I think theology can be different, but I don't think it always is. Sometimes I think it's just another word for magic user. They just call them clerics instead.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what I would say the difference is the idea of magic.
Right.
Like I said, we don't generally understand what it is. We can manipulate it, but there's always that sense of mystery.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Whereas theology, there's always like a god or a principle. So the cleric, makes an implantation to Pelor, and Pelor grants him the power. Whereas, the wizard uses signs and gestures to gather ambient energy from wherever and fire that off as a spell.
Yeah, well, Doctor Strange is summoning the hoary hosts of Haggoth and everything else. I mean, he's calling on what are supposed to be gods. So by your definition, that would technically make him a cleric, not a magic user.
Yep, and it kind of broaches another one of the weird problems you get with, fantasy theology, is if the gods are tangible entities...
Which they sometimes are.
Yeah, is it technically still fantasy? Or have you moved into something different because they're not a divine principle, they're just an more powerful being, and then that's runs you into Star Trek territory.
Very quickly, yeah, that's true. And then you have to start proving to the gods what love is, and by kissing Abraham Lincoln and everything else. I know. We haven't gotten to make that joke in a while.
No, we haven't. You're welcome, Jack.
We made that joke, I'm sure, in a couple early episodes, didn't we?
Yeah.
I vaguely remember. Anyway, there we go. Flashback. All right, so... That's true, although it's perfectly reasonable. I mean, even in Christian theology and many other religions have the idea of, the God manifested as flesh. So there's a great omnipotent being, but either sends down one of its children or a manifestation of itself or whatever to basically, communicate, interact with mankind. I mean, so you can have a God entity that actually interacts with the people, but still have an actual God there.
You can, but it's not the same as having the prime divine deity show up in your living room and say, "Hi, how you doing?"
Well, that's true.
Because if that happens, now faith is useless.
That's true. You don't have faith anymore because you literally know it to be true.
Yeah, now it's science and religion falls apart.
That's one way to look at it, because now it's just another king. It's just another social or spiritual level, and you have actual proof it exists. You don't need faith.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unless, as Terry Pratchett would probably point out, those gods do need your faith actually to exist. That they're existing based on your faith.
Yep, that's how it usually is. When you look at a lot of I'll take us to the fifth category. Which I would say is urban fantasy.
Okay. I thought that was hot kick-ass babes and werewolves.
Yeah, it kind of is. What you tend to see more and more nowadays, in the last, I'd say 20 years, is that you come back around where you take all of the tropes of fantasy and you move them into the modern world.
Yes. Yeah, that would be urban fantasy, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's why that becomes its own thing, because one of the things that you'll see to explain, why are all the ancient gods active now, is because that principle, this is how you can fudge it for science fiction too, that they need followers because it's somehow that devotion that powers them, and the more followers, the more powerful they are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There was a really, really good Aldebrand Snazz story about that.
Okay. I have no idea who that is, but you can tell me.
Well, the man with the double-decker dome. It's from 2000 AD.
Okay.
The British comic magazine. He's this, like, genius character, but his plans always go awry.
Okay.
And he ends up trapped in this interdimensional void at one point where he meets the ancient gods.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets this brilliant idea that he can rebrand them.
Okay.
So they help use what little power they have left to bring him back to, like, the modern day, and he rebrands them to get them new followers.
Mm-hmm.
So Apollo becomes, like, the god of, like, disco. And
okay.
The one I remember was Mars becomes the god of pinball machines. Because this is an old story. This is kind of like early, like 1980s. Late 70s, early 80s. So video games,
obviously.
But video games too. And then it gets out of hand because the gods bring back their old ways. And there's a scene where a bunch of Mars's followers are sacrificing a dude so they can get like a free play. And there's this speech, "O Mars, the god of the blinking lights and flashing bumpers, grant us a free play that we may continue on in your glories." They're murdering this guy.
Okay.
So that again, that's the way that you can kind of apply that notion to that idea of like theology,
right?
And bring it to like a modern setting. And again, you get that like the urban fantasy or. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of urban fantasy to deal with the magic thing. Mm-hmm. There'll be some kind of convergence that happens. That brings...
Yeah, the Shadowrun thing, basically, where some great event, the planets align, or the Aztec calendar runs out of numbers, or whatever, and we enter a new age where suddenly magic works again.
Yeah.
And suddenly science stops working and magic appears, and we all end up with these giant pictures on our chests that we can pull stuff out of and pull weapons from and everything.
Or however, because I think in some ways...
That was a Visionaries reference, folks.
Wasn't Visionaries post-apocalypse, though?
No, that was the whole point, was magic came back to their setting. They were actually a high-tech setting, and magic came back, and suddenly they, as I just said, all their technology stopped working, but Merlin suddenly popped up and said, "Yes, you're the knights of the magical realm, Visionaries," and but they all had these like images on their chest, and they could actually reach into their chest or something and pull out magic weapons from their image on their chest.
Yeah, or summon because they had powers.
Yeah, exactly, and sometimes some of them could summon vehicles and other stuff. Again, but all based on these like big images on their holographic images on their chest. Mm-hmm. And that was the deal with the toys.
Yeah.
And so anyway, sorry to anyway, but again, science fantasy, there we go. Mm-hmm. All right, so yes, sometimes that happens where in a lot of urban fantasy usually magic has come back under whatever circumstance. Now the trick of course with urban fantasy is, unlike the Visionaries, it coexists with technology. Like that's one of the requirements pretty much for urban fantasy, I think, is that you still have modern technology, you just have magic as well.
Yeah, usually. Because I've seen two sideways permutations on that.
Oh, okay.
Because one that kind of happened, I don't know if the MAGE role-playing game was responsible for it or not.
Okay.
But the idea in MAGE that technology is just another kind of magic.
Right. Oh, yes. Yeah, there's that one, yeah.
And then you get the idea, because I think urban fantasy broaches a certain amount of steampunk stuff.
Yes, it does.
Because there's a lot of steampunk that they go with the mad scientist angle, and then that sort of starts approaching this like the more fantasy oriented idea.
Definitely, and some steampunk does actually even have magic in it as well.
Yeah,
that's not uncommon. Definitely, the mage one's interesting. Probably for those who aren't familiar with it, basically in mage, technology works because everyone has agreed that it works. Everyone believes technology works, so therefore it does.
Yep.
But it's actually just another form of magic, and it's kind of overwritten the other forms of magic, which are making efforts to come back, which is the whole deal with mage.
Yeah, because what happens in the original mage, anyway, the first and second edition, I guess, was that reality...
Mage, the role-playing game, by the way, folks. Just in case you're wondering, not the comic by, what's his name? They used to advertise it for my first comics.
I can't remember.
Yeah, Matt something. Okay, we'll put it in the show notes. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Continue.
But it was the idea that reality is consensual. that things work because people believe they work. And what's happened is during like the Renaissance, you had the development of who became the technocracy later on, who are like your science and technology types. And what they've done is there's some kind of big disaster coming. And their belief was that the only way to save humanity was to lock down magic, was to lock reality into one absolute paradigm. And that's what technology was, because technology is magic that normal people can understand.
Right. Yeah.
And
which I thought was brilliant, actually. That's a great idea.
It really is. And like I say, I've seen a whole pile of other stories that kind of take that route. And I don't know if MAGE was the first one that did that, or if there was some like novel or something that did. But MAGE was the first time I can remember seeing that idea.
Right. Yeah. And it's brilliant. It really is. That's why I thought it was worth explaining to the audience and pointing that out, because I consider that, even though I've never actually played, I don't think, the MAGE role-playing game, I consider that still one of the most fascinating urban fantasy settings for a role-playing game I've ever seen. Just because of, just to continue this, of course, in the actual setting, if you're a mage and you're trying to do magical effects, how much your effects vary from the accepted reality determines how difficult it is to do that thing.
Yeah.
And so the players have to think about all these creative ways to work within reality to make their magic appear not to be magic.
Yeah. Well, and the other caveat to that in the game is that the difficulty of pulling that off, it depends. If there's like active minds, i.e. people witnessing what you're doing, that makes it easier or more difficult, because depending on the setting and what the people there believe, like if I want to do a healing spell and we're in the middle of an evangelical revival, that idea of laying of hands is part of that theology.
Right.
So if my character is professing to be like, the minister, and does this in front of all of those people, it's actually a lot easier because they believe it can happen.
Right, yeah.
If I'm in the middle of an operating room and I try pulling that, because the chances are everybody watching doesn't think that that's how you fix like a heart attack, it makes it a lot harder. And if I fail the roll, the results that affect me are a lot worse.
There's an interesting question then. In the mage setting, why don't all the mages just pretend to be like priests and nuns and stuff?
Because what ends up happening is they all believe different things.
Right.
And a lot of them hate each other.
Of course they do.
Because you do have the predominantly like Western theology, which is the celestial chorus, who would be like your Christians and that kind of thing.
Right.
But you also have the Akashic Brotherhood, who are like your like Eastern religions, like your Buddhists and your Taoists.
Right.
And what ends up happening is over the centuries, as these different groups have tried to gain dominance, they end up among the masses creating all these different conflicts in that, because people will say, no, this guy's right, you're full of shit. No, this guy's right, you're totally wrong. And then that's why you have all these different groups.
Right, yeah.
And then new things come out. So like there's two groups that splintered off of the technocracy.
Right.
And that was the Sons of Ether, who are your steampunk mad scientist guys.
Right.
Who have all kinds of crazy theories, but because people think it's cool, it gives them a certain measure of belief.
Right.
And then you had the virtual adepts, who, it's the Matrix. The Matrix is basically a ripoff of the virtual adepts.
Right.
That they see reality as essentially a giant computer program, and they can hack reality itself.
Right.
And of course, they think those stodgy old dudes that believe in like a god or meditation are all full of shit too, because obviously my powers work, so that must be how it really is.
Right. Well, it's a World of Darkness setting. There has to be many different factions, and they all have to hate each other. That's every World of Darkness setting.
Yep, but the idea in MAGE is that as your character advances, and they gain more basically wisdom is what you're gaining, they more and more don't have to deal with any of the trappings of their own belief, because the idea is they're starting to realize that no, reality is something totally different. Interesting.
So that's why they're capable doing more complex and powerful spells in a way as they go up in level, so to speak, because they're understanding more and more about the true nature of reality.
Yeah, and eventually you get to a point where, like, if say I'm a son of ether, and forces and prime are two of the spheres, the components that make up reality.
Right.
So forces is energy, and prime is like the primordial energy of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
When I start out, I may see that as electricity.
Right.
So I use electricity to develop my devices. I gain a little more enlightenment. I realize that electricity is just a manifestation of the unified field theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I can build my devices that they just gather ambient energy from, like, the universe, like, around me.
Mm-hmm.
It may be cosmic rays. It may be life energy. There's all kinds of different ways you look at it. But then I start realizing that there's some higher form that electricity is just a part of.
Right. So basically, when you first start out, you got to have batteries for everything and plug it in.
Yeah.
So once you get high enough levels, you're like, I can tap into the unified field theory, and suddenly everything doesn't need batteries anymore, but you can still produce the same effects.
Yeah, and then if my level gets high enough through playing, I don't even need that, because I realize that energy is just a myth. Matter and energy are all the same thing, and now I don't need to power anything. I build it all.
Right, yeah. You don't need to build anything at that point, do you? You basically are still likely to... you could just cast spells at that point. You're free of it, aren't you?
It depends, because what ends up happening... Two things in MAGE. What ends up happening is I may have that understanding of prime and energy and forces, but I may not have that level of understanding for life or matter.
Okay.
So the idea is I still need to, say, like, build my clone cyborg attack dog.
Right.
I realize it doesn't need batteries now, but I still think, but living matter is some kind of other sort of thing, that it's its own thing. It combines the ambient matter and energy of the universe in a living being, and that's a totally something different happens, and I have to kind of go through that progression specifically for those.
Right. Okay. I can see how that could work.
But that was one of the things that, like, because we played a lot of MAGE.
Right.
And it was one of the things that a lot of gamers had problems with, because gamers like a concrete rule, a concrete mechanic.
Right.
And it was there, but it took into account that idea of you had to think like your character to quote-unquote win at MAGE.
Right.
So if you were...
And that's difficult for a lot of players.
Yeah, because the mechanics were the same. And people would be like, well, I've got, like, Forces 3 and Prime 1 and Life 2. How come I can't just, like, touch that guy and, like, knock him out with, like, a taser zap? And it would be, well, because you're a member of the Celestial Chorus and everything is God's will.
Right.
So you have to come up with some kind of way to put it into that template. And the numbers, the mechanics and all of that were all exactly the same, but how the player presented it to the game master really affected outcome, and a lot of people had difficulty wrapping their head around that.
Do you think that's why MAGE wasn't one of the most popular of the White Wolf games back in the 90s?
It was pretty... It wasn't... I think Vampire was more popular because Anne Rice, everybody knew the template.
Werewolf was also more popular than Mage was.
It was, but Werewolf is basically, attack! So that's pretty easy to comprehend,
yeah, that's
too.
pretty straightforward.
Mage got a little weird. Wraith, I don't think they even kind of had a handle on.
Yeah, nobody understood Wraith.
And then Changeling was it was similar to Mage, but comedy, what? Fuck this. I'm gonna go play Werewolf and eat guys,
Well, exactly, yeah. Gamers want their power fantasy. They don't want comedy. Usually. We did the comedy RPG one. They do want it sometimes, but as I said back in that episode, I don't think they want large doses of it. I think most gamers would just rather have the natural kind of comedy that happens during a normal action-oriented game occasionally. The witty lines and that kind of stuff. They don't generally want a whole, like, campaign of comedy. Maybe a one session, but not more than that.
Well, not just that, but there's also the idea that comedy's tough, and this was...
It is.
When you got to... Mage is a good example of drama's tough, too, because to be a player, to participate in the game, you had to have kind of a higher level of writer ability than a lot of games.
Yeah,
like
see that.
Like D&D is pretty much, it's all straightforward. It's all given to you. If you're not like a fantastic writer, or you're not like terrifically inventive at making up characters, the mechanics are there enough that they can kind of help you along. But when you get into like MAGE, when you get into like some of the more like story oriented games that are out now, it puts a lot more onus on the players themselves. And I think that's something that people either have to get used to, or it might not be something they want. They want something a little more traditional game where this is my goal, this is how I achieve it, not we sit around making funny voices, you know.
No, I can totally see that. Yeah. Anyway, so let's continue on then. Okay, so I think we've now got your 5 different kinds of fantasy with the historical, high, low, science fantasy, and urban fantasy.
Yep.
Was there anything else you want to add about these different types of fantasy?
Nah, I think, like I say, I think those are broad enough that they kind of give you a jumping off point for pretty much everything.
I would agree, yeah. I think we can put almost all fantasy into one of these categories then. So I thought next, why don't we talk about, well, I think our audience already understands and knows D&D. I don't think we really have to go too much into depth about D&D style fantasy. I mean, it's become the generic default template basically for fantasy.
Yeah.
I mean, there's high fantasy and low fantasy versions of the D&D token-esque stuff. I mean, the low fantasy, for example, you'll get like Game of Thrones, for example, which for the most part is low fantasy, or at least it kind of starts low but then amps up as it goes.
Yeah.
By this point, at least in the TV series, and I think the books as well, it's pretty much, it's almost high fantasy at this point. But that's the whole point, is the magic is coming back to the world, right?
Right.
And but still, even though it doesn't have normal dwarves and elves and all that stuff, I would still consider it's become high fantasy anyway. We'll go with that. But there are definitely settings that are not D&D. I mean, D&D is not the only form of fantasy out there. I mean, there was once upon a time it was very popular. What did they call the John Carter style fantasy? That was Sword and Laser, was it? No, there was
something like that.
Something, because at one point there was a very popular in the early 20th century. There was a version of fantasy, and John Carter's a perfect example of that. Where you basically went to another planet and you explored the heck out of it, or got involved with stuff in that world. It's almost like a kind of portal fantasy, where the person from our world goes to that place. But it's not, especially because it predates it by quite a bit, it's not what we would consider normal fantasy. Like, there's actually original creatures there and races and stuff. I mean, Barsoom, the version of Mars in John Carter, has like 7 or 8 different kinds of different colored aliens and races. Yeah. Some of them have 4 arms, and some of them are like centaurs, and some of them like have 10 breasts, and it's all weird stuff. And it's and then like there's weird technologies, and that was a very popular kind of fantasy. And it's not post-apocalyptic. It's not really science fiction either. It truly is a form of fantasy, I'd argue.
Yeah, it's kind of what you get if you squash together like science, fantasy, historical, and urban.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, you kind of end up with that sort of thing.
So, if we had to actually pick a category, I'd say probably it's science fantasy, basically. Yeah. Because usually there is some element of science, although I don't think John Carter had much in the way of science in Barsoom. I don't think it had much. It had maybe a little bit.
Yeah, they did, but they didn't, because it was all like retro tech.
Right.
But it was weird, so they had like, well, we didn't have like motors on our boats, but they have like boats that hover and things like that. That it's retro technology, but because of the circumstances, they could do stuff we couldn't.
Right. Okay, and I would assume then Flash Gordon also would fit under this category, because it's pretty much the same kind of thing as John Carter, right?
It's kind of the next step, but again, I would say Flash Gordon is science fiction, because it goes with kind of more your idea that it's a future that didn't happen.
Not exactly. I mean, he goes to another planet that they have like, what is it, rabid vampire space dwarves and things like that. Like, it's pretty out there.
It really is, and it kind of well, of course, falls into the same idea as Star Wars.
Right.
But it's that it's I guess you'd say it's a was now that never did, not, didn't, won't happen.
Well, I will, and Ming does have magic in Flash Gordon. He does like weird mystical stuff.
Yeah, but it's got spaceships, so it's science fiction.
Okay, well, we want to go with that. We want to go with that definition, I suppose.
Because again, like, you're right, that could definitely be like straight up fantasy. Because it definitely comes from that whole fantasy, that John Carter line of thinking.
Right.
And like I say, this is why it's not necessarily good to worry about the specifics of the nomenclature.
Right.
But I do think, yeah, you do definitely have a case that Flash Gordon, I think in a lot of ways it's like an early superhero story.
Kind of. I generally think of superhero stories as taking place on our world, like they're part of our society and such, and they're putting on their masks to go out and fight crime. I mean, I know that's not always, except Green Lantern, obviously. People still think of Green Lantern as a superhero, but he goes off into space. Same with the Legion of Superheroes. I realize that. But I often consider those more science fiction stories than superhero stories, but that's my personal opinion. I know not everyone agrees on that.
Yeah, because it's that idea of, like we said, between fantasy and science fiction, you tend to get that superhero thing.
Right.
And like we said, the superhero thing tends to be about the extreme action, the extreme deeds.
True.
And that's kind of where like the Flash Gordon thing, all of the pulp sci-fi heroes, because the superheroes came out of that pulp tradition.
Yes, they did. Yep.
And that's why I think, like, say something like Flash Gordon, especially if you're going back to the actual original ones, they're so hard to catalog nowadays because they sit at one of those points where something became something else.
Right.
That they were a new type of space opera, science fiction that comes out of this fantasy pulp idea, and it kind of becomes, it starts its own thing because we can look at a whole shload of later stories, again, Star Wars especially, that are Flash Gordon-esque.
Right. Yeah.
That it really starts something all anew, but if you want to trace the genealogy, yeah, it goes back to that John Carter, like wanderer in a lost land kind of idea. And then that comes kind of from the old, like fantasy stories. And yeah, there's a whole, but I think...
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah,
right.
And we can go back way farther than that. But, okay, why don't we take things in a slightly different direction then? So do you have some favorite, like, fantasy stories or games? Do you want to discuss games, or do you want to just talk about fantasy, the genre in general?
I think they kind of tie in. Like, I like the idea of, like, discussing, say, role-playing games, because a game gives you, like, more tangible things, because it has to have rules and a definite setting.
That's true. Things are very clear in a game, but I can think of a few non-game settings that work too. But okay, let's work with game settings for now. Okay,
well, we can start there and then see where it goes.
Exactly. All right. So, do you have any, besides MAGE, obviously, do you have any other favorite fantasy game settings?
I have a little list here.
Surprise.
Some of them are sort of odd. I'll get the obvious one out of the way right away.
Right.
Warhammer.
Why Warhammer?
Warhammer, for us around here, was kind of, I guess, the first low fantasy role-playing game we'd ever played. Because again, it's very visceral. It's very, I want to say, down to earth and dirty. Because that's the game where, like, you don't pick your starting occupation, you roll, and guys will be like, "I'm a rat catcher," you know.
Yeah.
So and it was that idea that it was again, it's a British game, and it the background, the setting, the feel corresponds a lot more solidly to historic medieval Europe.
Okay.
And people don't realize it's a science fiction game.
Wait, it's a science fiction game?
Technically, yes.
Why?
Warhammer has the idea of chaos. And chaos is evil, and it makes you into a mutant, and there are gods of chaos.
Right.
What people don't realize, I don't know if this is still canon, because Warhammer's gone through like a bajillion different versions over the years.
Yeah, of course.
But the Warhammer Fantasy world, at each of the poles is a warp gate.
Right.
That the ancient Slann, who were these super advanced beings that were frogs, they could use warp gates to travel through space.
Right.
That they were like created wormholes. And if you've played 40,000, we're here 40,000, warp space was psychoreactive.
Right.
That it would absorb the thoughts and ideas of sentient beings, and they would actually affect the fabric of warp space. And over the centuries, they absorb, and this is where like the chaos gods come from. Like Khorne is the physical manifestation of hate and anger.
Right.
You know, Slaanesh is like is like selfishness and depravity. There's a bunch of different. Those are the big ones everybody knows. Nurgle is kind of like misplaced loyalty, I guess.
Right.
Tzeentch is like the god of secrets and is about, you know, like the things we keep to ourselves and keep hidden and dark hidden truths and that. And the chaos gods happen just because of all of these thoughts, these universal ideas coalesce once the warp was open by the Slann to the material world.
Right.
The Warhammer world had these two gates that broke, and chaos, the warp, is leaking through them, and that's what that chaos energy is that makes the evil mutants and monsters and stuff.
Wow, that is probably one of the best thought through like of the D&D style fantasy settings I've ever heard or seen. I have to say,
it really is. And it has so many like neat, weird twists because you have this high concept that's way in the background because it's all about your character starving to death in the streets of Middenheim because he can't catch enough rats to collect his bounty and stuff like that.
Right. Okay, let's see. So I should probably put one forward as well. We can kind of alternate on this thing. My case in fantasy, I should start. I think I might have mentioned this before, but I probably should definitely. I'm not a huge fantasy fan. I'm one of those odd people that I've always wanted to like fantasy more than I actually do. Okay. At least fantasy as it's traditionally presented, and there's the key. Actually, the D&D style fantasy setting I think is okay. I think it's like fine and everything, but it doesn't really how can I put this? It doesn't quite work for me. Maybe because I like my stuff a little more like romantic, I guess in some ways. I mean, I've played Warhammer Fantasy and I've enjoyed it. I've played D&D and I've enjoyed it too. I mean, I've had fun with it, but it's never really spoken to me on a deep level. Okay, so my fantasy games that I tend to like, maybe again that's a setting thing, usually are the more like Asian or Asian-esque fantasy. Okay, so that's why. So for example, one fantasy setting that I'm very fond of is the Weapons of the Gods one that we've mentioned before on the show. The Weapons of the Gods setting, which is a Wuxia style fantasy setting, which I really enjoyed the heck out of because again, it's different. Like it's more about characters that are like larger than life, more action packed. It's kind of one of those. I guess you could say it really kind of straddles the line between the superhero stuff and the fantasy stuff.
Right.
So if you had to ask me what kind of fantasy I like, I guess the answer would be, and this came up earlier, obviously, the high fantasy, or maybe what I would call the very high fantasy level in some ways. Definitely the epic fantasy. I like all levels to one degree or another, but I just have a preference for that. So Weapons of the Gods, of course, is a game where, I think it's out of print now, but you are playing different types of wuxia type characters. In other words, it's Chinese fantasy. Okay, it's epic Chinese fantasy where you're playing these warriors that have like special magical techniques and everything, and everybody who is a player in the setting has some kind of weird martial arts magic, or it's magic basically, or superpowers. Take your pick.
Right.
And they can build on them and work with them, and it's a setting that I really enjoy because again, it's one built around the idea of being as cool as you can possibly be. Like you literally get points for being as cool as you can possibly, for doing cool and interesting things. The system is literally designed to reward you for that. And that's something that I really appreciate. Not just because it's not just because it's more Asian style, but also because of that it's something where, if your character is like, leaping around and bouncing off things and using the environment, you get bonuses for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's encouraged in Weapons of the Gods, and that's something that I like. I like a one that encourages, the player to interact with their environment, and it makes the whole thing more real in some ways and more lively. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I would say Weapons of the Gods might be my number one fantasy role-playing game. And it kind of ties in with my number two, which I might as well say now as well, because they're very similar to each other, is Exalted. Exalted is basically an attempt. They both came out around the same time. People are probably more familiar with Exalted than Weapons of the Gods. Exalted is basically that kind of thing merged with Western fantasy, is the best way to describe it. Okay. It's a hybrid between the wuxia, over-the-top action role playing and the Western style stuff. So you have characters that are more what we would understand as the Western style characters, but it's mixed with the wuxia action and action adventure style. Right. Plus, the Exalted setting is actually, I find it quite interesting. The idea with Exalted is basically that the characters are all the descendants of gods to one degree or another. That's why they're called Exalteds. Right. And so you've got all these characters that have inherited some god blood, and to one degree or another, they're learning how to control that god blood, depending on what strain of god blood they've got, and how they use it can produce all kinds of different effects. Mm-hmm. And so I find that a fascinating idea. I like the idea of the magic again is kind of explained in the setting. Well, it's magic because there are gods and such, but most of the old gods were killed. The actual gods, I think, in Exalted are mostly gone, but their descendants are still around, and they've mixed with humans and such. And so that's where all these people can run on rooftops and jump 50 meters and things like that. It's because they've got god blood in them. So it allows for these larger than life Japanese high Asian style battles that again you'll see in like Chinese movies and such, which are very lively and very interesting. And again, I'm a little more super heroic, so that's what works for me. Okay,
because Exalted it's kind of covers a bunch of different things. Because if anybody's never seen it, the idea is that there were originally 3 groups of gods that people are aware of because they add more later on.
Yep.
And 2 of those groups, the one group, the Dragon Blood, teamed up with, who are the Brainiacs? The guys that teamed up with them.
Because there's the Solar Exalts, there's the Dragon Blood, and there's the Dragon Blood's the Earth one?
Yeah.
They're so what do they call them? I'm blanking on it.
Yeah, me too. Because what the story was is the Solars were in control. And the dragons overthrew them because they thought the Solars were assholes, and they kind of were.
Yeah.
And the other guys, the Brainiac guys who I can't remember, kind of help the dragons. They have their own agenda, but they help.
Are you talking about the Lunar Exalted?
Yeah, that's them.
Yep.
That they helped out and they killed off the Solar, but what's been happening is there's been Solar Exalted, the people with their powers, that are starting to pop up in the kingdom, and nobody's exactly sure why.
Right, yeah. Yep, definitely.
And then when it goes on, you find out there were other types, because there were the Abyssals.
Yeah, there's the Abyssals, there's a Sidereal. There's actually...
The Autochthonians.
Yep, which is the Alchemo Exalted, and there's also the Inferno Exalted, which are basically like the demon guys. And there's some other ones, too.
Yeah.
And the Exalted setting itself, I always found was interesting. They say that the world itself is supposed to be, like, huge. It's like someone basically built a planet on top of, like, a Jupiter-sized world. Mm-hmm. Like, the world is supposed to be so big that you can have whole massive epic campaigns and never influence, like, the stuff going on in the other parts of the world at all. That was they kind of did that on purpose. But the setting is massive.
Yeah.
And so the idea being you can do anything with it, really. That almost any kind of story could be happening somewhere in this massive setting is the idea.
And it also may or may not tie into the World of Darkness.
Right, I've heard that, yeah.
Because it might be the past of the World of Darkness, or it might be the future, because there's a lot of ideas that tie in.
That doesn't surprise me. Well, again, it's another White Wolf game.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was their attempt to kind of merge, the anime that was popular in the late '90s, early 2000s, some like Ninja Scroll and some of the other high level anime stuff that was popular with fantasy and the Monkey King and all this other it was kind of bring all these different elements together to a really high action packed godlike fantasy setting, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. It really is. I mean, Exalted is one of my, I would say, favorite fantasy settings.
Yeah, because I got to go, too. You mentioned Weapons of the Gods.
Yep.
That's probably the most philosophical role-playing game ever written.
I've never heard it described that way, but okay.
Well, because when you make your character, you're not just like, I pick these powers. You're picking your character's like philosophy and worldview.
True.
And that all like ties in with how the game plays. And there's these huge chapters because the basic rule book is gigantic.
It's like a phone book, yeah.
Yeah, a hardcover phone book. You squash a bug with that, it stays squashed.
Yep, even a cockroach. Yep.
Yeah, and there's like chapters about philosophy and beliefs, and it all ties into the game. And it's kind of it's one of those things that would take a little bit to get into. But it would be totally worth it because it is really kind of its own unique sort of game.
It is. It absolutely is. And that's one of the reasons I love it. And yes, I would agree with you. It is one of those games that I think, well, I would say that would require a little bit of extra work to get into because it's so different. But, and I've mentioned this before on the show, actually, I'm not even sure if it's available anymore because Weapons of the Gods is out of print as far as I know. But the first adventure that comes with it, which I'm now blanking on the description of. I mentioned in the show before. It's absolutely amazing. Mm-hmm. It's one of the best tutorial-style adventures that I've ever seen. Like, it really is. It's not Interesting Times. Crap, what's the first one called? Okay, I'll have to look it up. Oh. Hold on a sec. Because it is amazing. It really is. I highly recommend it. Can't recommend it enough. Now, of course, I'm totally biased because I love the whole Asian martial arts philosophies and all that stuff. But Auspicious Beginnings.
Oh,
there it is.
Yeah,
it's Auspicious Beginnings. Okay, I've got a PDF copy here, and it's very well done. It goes several rounds. And what's happening is each round teaches you a different thing about your powers because what you're basically doing is you're participating in a kind of martial arts tournament to start. That's how you start. You're players in a martial arts tournament, and you're going through different rounds. And each of the tasks you have to do. Now, it's not fighting tournament, not at first. You have to do these tasks, and they all basically are teaching you how to use the character's abilities and how it all comes together. And can't recommend it enough. Definitely Weapons of the Gods is So Weapons of the Gods is probably my favorite. As I said, you'll find that my fantasy tastes tend to actually lean towards the Asian style stuff or the higher level fantasy. I mean, I do appreciate the Warhammer fantasy. I played it, enjoyed it. Yeah, that had some good times with it, but it's not my personal favorite. Okay, so what's another favorite fantasy setting of yours? Now that we've covered two of them, or three actually.
I'm going to go a little weird, I think, for my next one.
Okay, good choice. What is it?
Not that I don't have a wide variety of weird to pick from.
Right, you do.
I'm going to go with an odd game a lot of people probably never heard of, is Airship Pirates.
Even I have never heard of that, sir. So, okay. Airship Pirates, let's hear it.
It's a weird post-apocalypse steampunk fantasy kind of setting based on the music of the band Abney Park.
Okay.
And the whole premise of the game is that in 1906, I believe it was the British government had developed the Chrononautilus, which was a time-traveling ship, and they activated it. But there was a problem, and it broke time.
Oops.
Yeah, oops is right. So the world that ends up forming after this horribly failed experiment, and it fails for a few reasons. You kind of have to either listen to the songs or read the game or both. It's this pseudo steampunk kind of setting where most things are wilderness. You've got very limited technology because there's there's the Neo-Victorians who have built this giant fortress city.
Mm-hmm.
And the lords of the city destroy technology because they blame technology for the resulting apocalypse.
Right.
And all of technology is taken here and destroyed, except little bits get out. And what ends up getting out, because what works now is like total mad science works.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody, you've got these like big gas-filled like flying ships.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the say 1600s mad science is how you describe the technology of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's these like different groups, and it's because everything's broken. So imaginary stuff works,
right,
along very specific lines because of how reality shuffled itself out.
Okay.
It's a weird setting, and the mechanics of the game are equally weird because if your character is competent enough, they can do almost anything.
Right.
Like your one character can hop onto an enemy airship and just like sword fight the entire crew to a standstill.
Oh, okay.
If you're good enough. And the way it works is as you develop your character, you get big honking huge handfuls of dice that you throw.
Right.
And it's another game you need certain numbers for success, but they also add the concept of the black dice.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really get penalties to your chance to succeed. You get a certain number of black dice that you roll.
Right.
And if the successes on those dice outnumber the successes on your regular dice, something horrible happens.
Right.
So the whole game is geared towards just over-the-top action.
Right.
In this bizarre over-the-top setting.
I can definitely see how you'd appreciate that. You know, when I think about it, though, I don't really have any other, like, for me, I don't really have any other particular fantasy games. I mean, there are a few borderline ones. I'm fond of Rifts, of course, which you could argue whether that's a science fantasy game or not. I would probably say it is, but, you know, Rifts is kind of everything, so...
Yeah.
Same with Shadowrun. Shadowrun's a lot of fun. Urban fantasy, there we go. I mean, that can be a good one. But again, it's so borderline with like Cyberpunk. I tend to think of Cyberpunk as more of a Shadowrun, as more of a cyberpunk game than a fantasy game in a lot of ways. It's more cyberpunk with fantasy tropes stuck into it.
I think I'm able to fix that for you.
Okay, sure, go for it.
Because there's another game it's another steampunk game. Mm-hmm. But it's what would happen if Shadowrun happened in like the 1800s.
Oh, okay.
And that was Victoriana.
I do not know Victoriana. Okay. Wow, you're really into these like obscure games. Okay, let's hear about it.
You don't know the half of it. Victoriana, which is I'm familiar with like the first and second edition. They're up to at least third.
Right.
The setting is It's picture the Victorian era. Mm-hmm. Magic is a thing.
Yep.
It's treated a little differently because the theology is a big part of the game.
Okay.
There's like human-animal hybrids in one of the races. There are elves.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's all these different races that have been around for a bit. The biggest change is that they have a form of Christianity.
Right.
But their equivalent of Jesus wasn't this philosopher who taught peace. He was a Roman centurion.
Oh, okay.
And he kind of went down the same road, but in a more militant fashion. Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of the setting. The setting is a little more militaristic than typical steampunk is.
Right.
It's a little more like aggressive, a little touch more angry, I guess you'd say. Mm. And this is part of why. And then there's also like other gods.
Right.
And this is where magic comes from. These other like they're kind of like low-powered chaos gods in Warhammer. Mm-hmm. And they've infiltrated, and this is where like the spiritualism of the day and the secret clubs and that of the day, because in real life in the Victorian era, those were all big things.
Oh yeah.
In the game, they've been kind of usurped by these like evil deities and demonic entities that are trying to take apart society.
Oh, okay. So they had Facebook back then. Thank you, folks.
But yeah, it's another one that because of the low-tech setting, it moves more towards the fantasy idea than, say, Shadowrun, because, again, the technology is a big part of Shadowrun.
Yeah, it is. That's why I say that I think it leans very heavily towards cyberpunk, and with just, with fantasy races, basically.
Yeah, and Shadowrun, the magic, again, is fairly well understood. Whereas if you get to Victoriana, it's kind of well understood, but there's always that possibility of evil behind it.
Yes.
And that gives you that unknown, and that's another thing I think takes it a little closer to a fantasy idea.
Okay, so yeah, it does sound like Victoriana is definitely that's definitely the fantasy version of that.
Yeah.
I could definitely buy that. Okay. Beyond that, like I said, I appreciate like D&D and the other settings. I mean, there's a couple fantasy things I've always thought had some nice touches. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, RuneQuest, of course, the Chaosium fantasy game.
Yeah.
I always thought was kind of neat for making, I don't know why, I've mentioned this before, for making elves into plant people. I always thought that was kind of a nice touch. Because it makes them not just humans with long ears, but it really makes them a little bit alien in a way, and I like that.
Right.
But as far as like role-playing fantasy settings go, I can't really think of that many other ones that really appeal to me that much.
Yeah,
I mean, because they're mostly just D&D in one form or another with little touches like that, obviously. I mean, maybe the Mouse Guard role-playing game, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, that's I know a guy who's like obsessed with that one.
That's not a surprise. It is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, I've read through the book. I haven't had the chance to actually play it, but I've read through the book. And yeah, that was actually I read the original comic as well, and it's actually very well done. Yeah. For those who aren't familiar, think of it as a medieval fantasy-esque setting, except all the players are mice, and so they're the size of mice, except that they have, they have clothes and ambidextrous hands and everything like that, and all the monsters are just other animals.
Yeah, you know what it is?
What?
It's the mouse version of Bunnies and Burrows.
Pretty much, yeah. Except you don't run out of energy doing everything like Bunnies and Burrows apparently does.
Yeah, that was the only hang up on that game. I look out the window, snore. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas Mouse Guard is basically a straight up low fantasy game. Yeah. You just happen to be mice, and a lot of the other the major animals you're dealing with are, of course, other real world animals. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was a really nice touch. I mean, that's it's kind of fun. Yeah. I mean, it puts a nice spin on it, because that's one of the problems I generally have with fantasy, especially Western fantasy. And again, we can talk about this. I know why they do it, but is the fact that pretty much all Western fantasy at this point is just Tolkien and D&D.
Yeah, basically.
I mean, you don't see many other variants. Now, I understand why. We kind of covered it earlier, right? I mean, everyone just kind of automatically understands it. So it's much easier to do D&D with this one twist than it is to actually come up with a fully different fantasy setting, like to come up with an original one.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see them very often. And heck, that's what the audience seems to want, right?
Right.
But at the same time, there's a lot to be said. I mean, there's a lot of other kind of fantasy we could be doing that we're simply not. Just because everyone's just so focused on doing D&D type stuff. I mean, you will see occasionally other stuff. I mean, even TSR did release some other kinds of fantasy. So, of course, they had their Oriental Adventures, D&D in the Orient. But they did have, Dark Sun, which was like kind of a desert fantasy kind of thing. Okay, that was different. I mean, at least a little bit different, but I'll accept different. I mean, there's Arthurian fantasy, of course, which never quite seems to catch on. Sorry, Jack, but it never really seems to catch on very well. People love the King Arthur stuff, but they would more rather just play a paladin in D&D than they would play an actual proper King Arthur game, generally speaking. Because
the problem with, like, say, your King Arthur thing is it feels like a specific character in another setting now.
That's true.
Like, it's got the problem that the knightly thing has been done so many times that even if you go back to the original, for most of your audience, it's going to feel like old hat.
Yeah, it is. Maybe. I mean, we might be at a point where the knight thing has been kind of left, pushed to the side so much that maybe for the current generation, it won't feel like old hat anymore.
Maybe.
I mean, because a lot of them, they probably know who King Arthur is, but I mean, that was an actual genre. I don't know if you realize this. Like even, I think it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, if I remember right, wrote an actual fantasy series like about knights as well. I mean, there was a thing, or there was a period where people actually wrote like all these knightly fantasies. Basically, they didn't usually involve a lot of magic. Maybe there was a dragon involved. They were mostly about knights going on adventures and stuff.
Right.
But that was actually a thing at one point, like over 100 years ago. And obviously inspired largely by the whole Arthurian stuff.
Right.
And then that kind of just disappeared. Well, it hasn't been popular for quite a while.
It comes back every now and then. Like every couple of years, somebody does like another King Arthur movie or another Knight's Tale or something. But again, I think what you get in the modern era is a lot of people associate that with D&D and or Tolkien, and they're waiting for the orcs.
Pretty much, yeah. Watching these humans bash on each other, not that interesting. Where they're waiting for that dragon to show up.
Yeah, and that's where you can get, like, say, Game of Thrones is basically that, but with
exactly that.
Just enough of a touch of the ultra fantastic that it feels different, and then they show tits, which of course is always popular.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. And Game of Thrones did the tease thing where they basically literally from the beginning of the first book, they were teasing all the fantasy monsters and such.
Yeah.
And then it takes them forever. Spoilers, but they do eventually show up, but it takes a while.
Yeah.
For you to get them, but you do have them, and that satisfies that itch, I suppose.
Yeah, because that kind of, you can, there's I'm going to bring up another really obscure role-playing game here.
Okay, sure.
A newer one. Because you can do permutations of the old, like, say, D&D formula.
Right.
And one that I've recently seen that I kind of got a kick out of was for the D20 D&D, they did the Crushed supplement.
Right.
Which is based on this weird anthro webcomic comedy story.
Okay.
And they essentially took D&D and D&D'd it up.
Okay, how do you D&D up D&D?
Well, the main premise of the setting is that certain people are heroes. And you never know if you're a hero or not, like a player character, essentially.
Right.
Until you die. Because
okay.
Real heroes don't die. You sort of reincarnate naked without all your equipment at this, like, temple.
Right, but when you know that you were a hero once you reincarnated?
Yeah, but not until you get killed do you realize.
The first time. Okay, the first time you die, you suddenly discover, oh wait, I'm a hero.
And so you got this weird setting with all of these, like, picture D&D where nobody's really afraid to, like, get killed.
Right.
Except you kind of are, because it hurts and it's a pain in the ass to have to gather up all your stuff again and that kind of thing.
Well, that's where we get into a lot of the lit RPG, which we talked about before, and even a lot of the game style fantasy that's come out. I mean, one of the things that's happened in Japan, I might as well bring this up, one of the things that's happened in Japan with the whole light novel movement, especially in the last 5 years, they've basically become overwhelmed with fantasy novels. Most of which are lit RPG about a character, or portal fantasy, where a character goes to another world, or they go to another computer world, simulation world, or whatever. But they're all pretty much character from our world goes somewhere else, basically, is what they almost all are. And I've seen numbers that indicate there are the Japanese have written tens of thousands of these things.
Right.
And what we're seeing, there's actually a huge movement right now of these light novels, because most of them are written as light novels, being published over here. There's actually a big light novel movement going on right now. And so one of the things that I'm impressed by, actually, is that a lot of them are different takes. Now, again, these are the best of those tens of thousands of novels. There's the catch, okay? These are the best of them. Okay, so what's happening is the ones that people are going for are the ones that aren't just generic fantasy world, but have put a decent twist on it. We mentioned, and we were doing the one on shonen manga, we mentioned, what is it? I've been reincarnated as a slime, or I believe it's called, or something to that effect. And we mentioned I'm a spider. So what?
Yeah,
that was the one we mentioned. But there's another one where you're a slime as well. I was reading a little bit of that one before, and the one thing I will give them is, they're trying some different takes on fantasy settings. Like
Right.
they're trying different things with fantasy settings than we are here, and I'll give them absolute points on that, because they're all in this competition to see who can come up with this new novel twist on fantasy that will actually, get sales, basically, give them a readership, and possibly get them a book contract, because they're mostly written for free on websites, right?
Right.
And maybe an anime and all that other stuff, but you have to come up with something that's really going to catch people's attention.
Right.
You can't just have a normal fantasy setting or situation. And so they're coming up with all these different bizarre ones. I was telling Dawn before the show about one that partly inspired doing this episode today. There's one called No Game, No Life, which is, the short version is, it's about two shut-in gamers, a shut-in gamer and his sister basically end up in this other fantasy world, which I found fascinating. There's a book. There probably is a comic. There definitely is a comic. There's an animated version you can find on Crunchyroll if you're curious about it. No Game, No Life. It's actually really addictive. It's kind of interesting. But basically, they end up in this fantasy world where what's happened is that there was a war of the gods. This isn't spoiling anything. They literally tell you this at the beginning. There was a war of the gods, and the god that won was the trickster god. And so, or maybe by letting all the other ones die, who knows, whatever. The key point is the trickster god is obsessed with games and such. And so the trickster god basically rewrote the rules of reality for this other world, where what's happening is there's no war, there's no fighting, there's no killing. People aren't allowed to kill each other. People aren't allowed to even steal things from each other. Instead, everyone lives by these 10 rules of the world, 10 rules of reality, basically, because if you're a god, you can rewrite the rules of reality. It doesn't just mean giving people in a setting, magic powers or letting clerics hero people. You can literally play with the rules of reality. And this is something that I very rarely see done. And so that's one of the things that impressed me. And the rules of reality in this case are all designed to basically make people constantly have to play games with each other to accomplish things. And so they have to engage in some form of competition or game to do anything in this setting to get other people. So literary wars can be fought in this setting with games of poker, though usually they're slightly bigger, more eventful games and such. Mm-hmm. And or whatever. But the thing is, to accomplish anything, you have to play a game with someone, and whatever stakes you set on, those stakes are literally enforced by God after that point, which leads to some entertaining and funny situations. But again, the point is that even though these rules and everything were all set up basically to facilitate this story, of course, where these gamers from our world end up in that world, and then because they're so good at games, they absolutely kick ass. Most of these light novel stories, they're all power fantasies of one kind or another.
Yeah.
The point is that the author really thought some of this stuff through. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with a fantasy world that's actually quite different than what you would normally see.
Right.
And that's the type of difference that I like to see. Like, I like to see these fantasy settings that are not just thought through. That's something I love, but are also a different take on fantasy or a different style of fantasy.
Yeah, and for the audience, there's also a 7-minute version of No Game, No Life.
Yes, you can find it, No Game, No Life, in 7 minutes on YouTube. You can find it. Mind you, that focuses on some of the more odd aspects of it, but it's really funny. It's really funny. I saw that first, and then I went and watched the real show. It doesn't really spoil that much, oddly enough.
No, it
kind of does a little bit, but oddly enough, it doesn't spoil that much. The 7-minute version.
Yeah, I got a kick out of that. In my world, we have a thing called the Heart of the Cards. You're just playing Yu-Gi-Oh! No, that's
exactly. It's a lot of fun, and so things like that. I mean, the Japanese, of course, have been doing some of the more different fantasy settings. I mean, Naruto, for example, or at least the first half of Naruto has a fairly different fantasy setting. Yeah. And the setting just kind of disappears for the second half, but whatever. Yeah. One Piece, again, has a fairly unique and oddly well thought through fantasy setting. Mm-hmm. Like, really weirdly thought through in many ways as it's gone on. He keeps explaining things that you thought, oh, that's just some weird fantasy thing. And then you look back and then it's like, holy crap, there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. And it's astounding. I think he mostly just throws weird stuff in and explains it later on, but still, it all works. It all seems to work. So you never know what he's planned and what he hasn't. That's the thing about Oda.
Right.
And so it's these other types of non-D&D fantasy settings that I really do, I'm really found I'm more pulled to. Not just because they're Asian, but just because they're different takes on fantasy.
Yeah, I think part of the problem we run into with fantasy proper and coming up with new versions is that in a lot of ways, fantasy by definition is based around tradition.
That's true.
So it's hard to think of essentially a new tradition to base your setting on.
Right.
Where science fiction has the advantage that we're always inventing something new, and then you can blow that up into however big in whatever setting you want to do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't actually thought of that, but I think you're exactly right. I mean, it is more difficult because with fantasy, we can only really work with what's already there.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why in the last decade or two, you've seen the urban fantasy idea, because that kind of gives you the advantage of both. You can have, he's a wizard with a cell phone, and then you can hijinks ensue.
Right. Yep. Actually, there's another light novel called "I'm Trapped in a Fantasy World with My Cell Phone," or I'm in a fantasy world with my cell phone, something to that effect, which is about a guy who's accidentally killed, and it's kind of funny. So God's like, "Well, I'm really sorry about this, but I can't send you back to your own world because you're dead there. Do you want to just go to this fantasy setting?" And the guy's like, "Oh, okay." And he's like, "Can I make my phone work in the setting?" It's like, "Okay." So he goes to a fantasy setting with his cell phone, and then begins using the knowledge because he can access. He can call God if he really needs to, but he's mostly got all access to the internet and everything. He's basically got access to Wikipedia and the internet, but he's in a fantasy world. So he's using the knowledge that he's got on this phone to actually to build a new life and to change the world.
Yeah.
See, things like that, they're a nice touch. But the setting itself is just really, really, really generic fantasy. I mean, the Japanese have an even more generic version of D&D than we do. That's kind of their default.
Yeah.
It's the exact same as traditional D&D, except you got cat girls in it. And there's always some weird animal race, usually cat girls. But other than that, because their version of D&D is basically, was it the early Final Fantasy games, and what's the other one? The one that the Dragon Ball guy did the art for, Dragon Quest.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, but those are basically D&D.
They're D&D. They're D&D.
Japan's version, inspiration for D&D was D&D. It was crazy popular there.
Yep. And as an end result, they have this generic RPG version of it, though. But your average person doesn't know Dungeons and Dragons as a tabletop game in Japan, as far as I know. They only really know fantasy role playing as in the computer game version, like from the Super NES, like Dragon Quest and things like that. That to them is fantasy, but it's D&D still.
Yeah, and I think it's the same reason why that would be their intro to Western fantasy, and it's why here in North America, everybody's idea of Eastern fantasy is the guy with the giant mustache. Your powers are no match for mine. I will kung fu you. Let's fight. Because that's the little taste that we grew up with, all the Chopsaki movies.
For our generation, yes. For the current generation, I would disagree. They're actually more inspired by the anime stuff.
Yeah.
So their idea of Asian fantasy is more like Ninja Scroll, basically. It's Naruto. It's Naruto, it's Ninja Scroll, it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't even think most of them even think of One Piece as fantasy. Probably most of them look at it think of it as like steampunk or something.
Yeah, because it kind of is.
It kind of is. Yeah, One Piece is one of those variants. But I would argue One Piece is still... because of the devil fruit magical aspect of it, I would say it leans more towards fantasy, but it kind of is steampunk too.
It's got cyborgs. Right.
It's got cyborgs, that's true. They're steam powered cyborg, or Frankie, if I remember it, he's like coke powered, if I remember right. He's working on carbonated liquids and such. So you're right, it does have that stuff. Maybe One Piece is actually more of a steampunk thing. But in the end, really, it's like a superhero battle manga anyway. It's just that's all just background. But whatever.
Right.
thing, I actually do prefer non-conventional or non-token D&D-esque fantasy.
Right.
And I encourage authors to try different kinds of fantasy. I mean, even if you're just, doing something based off, I don't know, African stuff or Russian stuff or Fijian, low folklore or something. Try something different sometimes. I mean, there's lots of other different fantasy backgrounds out there, and we generally just kind of ignore them.
Of course, you know what the brutal irony of that is?
What?
The very original White Book D&D had all that stuff.
In the Monster Manual, didn't it?
No, they did when they did the first deities and demigods.
Oh, yes. That's the book I was... Yeah, they included all the different...
Not the hardcover one. I'm talking the original little White Book one.
Really?
Yeah, they had tons of different, pantheons, and they published in, Dragon and Strategic Review, I think, had the first couple. There were, tons of them. They included, everybody, and you got, a quick rundown of the culture and some of the monsters, and clerics of this guy will do this and that. Yeah, it was all right there from the beginning. It's just we kind of lost a lot of that.
Wow. Huh. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Well, okay. Was there anything else you wanted to cover about fantasy? I think we've covered the basics pretty much.
Yeah, we did. The thing that I find that kind of struck me, and it's exciting and frightening at the same time, because you get to this idea that, and we've talked about it before, how each generation takes the stuff they grew up with and then kind of tailors it to themselves as they go on. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think a lot of what we get now for fantasy and sword and sorcery is Tolkien and D&D. Mm-hmm. Because going back to, say, even our parents' generation, Tolkien was the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tolkien, Conan, D&D borrows a lot from them. D&D kind of solidified it back in, for our generation. And that's what everybody still kind of draws from.
Right.
The thing that puts me in mind that I find that, because I'm going to see this in my lifetime, is what is the dark, gritty My Little Pony going to be like?
Oh, you had to go there, didn't you?
I know, because we're going to experience it. We're gonna see it.
What is the dark, gritty My Little Pony going to be like? Well, I think that's an excellent question for people to go to obeythedna.com and write a comment to this show and tell us what the dark, gritty My Little Pony will be like. Leave a comment. Share a link. Let people know that the podcast is out there and that we're talking about My Little Pony again.
I have a new shtick!
But then again, I'm the one who asked for non-conventional, non-D&D fantasy, and that My Little Pony definitely counts.
There is a game.
And there is a game. I'm still not playing it, but there is a game. There is definitely a game.
See,
I think...
And that proves it. That's my new... Instead of GURPS Ice Age being the game I scare my group with, that's the new one.
I can totally see that. I know there are a lot of aspects of fantasy we haven't covered today. People are thinking about, why didn't you talk more about, magic? Or why didn't you talk more about different fantasy races or other stuff like that? We'll do that another show. Mm-hmm. We'll actually do a show on those. We'll probably even do a show maybe on some of the more specific, detailed versions of fantasy. Maybe we'll do a show on Arthurian fantasy at some point. We'll see. Or historical fantasy. I mean, that could probably be fun. Mm-hmm. But... this was meant to be kind of a very basic primer to some of the different kinds of fantasy and our takes on fantasy and how we see it, basically. Yeah. And we will talk more about fantasy at some point in the future, because as everyone who's been listening to us knows, we kind of jump around from topic to topic, and we eventually work our way back to almost everything. Mm-hmm. So, on that note, thank you, everyone, very much for listening to us ramble on about fantasy for 2 hours. I hope you found it at least somewhat entertaining and or interesting. And as I said before, check out obeythedna.com for our show notes and our past episodes. Mm-hmm. And tell a friend about the show. Good night, everyone. Bye.
Good luck.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.